So, all right.
Great, sure. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining. I'm here in Springfield, Illinois. This is close to where I grew up. I now live in New York, but I'm back here visiting family. This is, by the way, my brother-in-law's ball wall. All of these balls behind me are signed. He's a big collector of baseball memorabilia. We're big Cardinal fans, so I would say probably 98% of these balls are Cardinal-related balls. So yeah, writing a book about the Cleveland Indians is a little bit of a stretch for me. I'll detail briefly how that happened. My dad was a huge Cardinal fan. He had season tickets, or at least he split them with some people. So I grew up going to games. He listened to every game on the radio. So I grew up with baseball as the sort of background noise of my childhood. But my grandpa, his father, was a big fan of the St. Louis Browns. I'm sure everybody here knows that St. Louis used to have two baseball teams, or at least Major League Baseball teams, the St. Louis Cardinals and the St. Louis Browns. My grandpa was odd in that he liked the lesser of the two teams. He worked in St. Louis during World War II and used to go to lots of Browns games during that time. So I grew up hearing a lot about his Browns fandom. And of course, anybody who knows anything about the Browns knows that Bill Veeck was the last owner of the team in its iteration in St. Louis. So I had read Veeck is in Rec as a young kid and was really fascinated by all the things that Veeck did and what he stood for and all that sort of thing. And for whatever reason, I returned to the book as an adult and, just recognize right away that Veeck is the perfect character for a book. He's larger than life. He doesn't ever seem to sleep. He wears his own clothing that doesn't have anything to do with the times. Like, he kind of invents the modern stadium experience. He's outrageous. He's forward thinking. He's progressive in his views on baseball. Like, all of these sorts of things that you would want in a character is there. So I set out to write a book about Veeck and the Browns. That was the original intention of the book. I interviewed several Browns players before they passed away. That was what I was going to do. And it was only whenever I went to the New York Public Library, and there at the New York Public Library, it's really great. They have bound editions of the sporting news, so you don't have to look them up online or anything like that. You can actually check them out by year. So you can get the entirety of 1946, 47, 48. That's what I did, just to do some sort of background reading on Veeck's earlier tenure as owner of the Indians. And you can sort of sit there in the New York Public Library and read the sporting news like a novel almost, which was really great. And as I was reading through 46, 47, 48, just to get a sense of who Bill Veeck was before he owned the Browns, I started noticing all these other names that were really prominent at that time: Bob Feller, Larry Doby, Satchel Paige. And it was while flipping through the sporting news that I started thinking about that if you took these four characters, two white men in Bill Veeck and Bob Feller, two black men in Larry Doby and Satchel Paige, and you put them all together into a narrative, you could tell a sort of different story about integration than the one that at least I, as a sort of general fan, was told about, which centered almost exclusively on Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey. But in these four men, you had pretty much all the views represented. You had the more progressive view in Bill Veeck and his attitude toward integration. You had a bit of a more traditionalist view in Bob Feller, even though his views were rather complex when it came to integration. And then you had two different generations of the Negro Leagues in Larry Doby and Satchel Paige, with different philosophies of how to handle themselves and how to approach integration, so much so that these two men just simply did not get along. So I really thought that if you put all of these people together and in tension with each other, you could generate a really great narrative. And since I'm not from Cleveland and knew nothing about the Indians, really, I think I knew more about the St. Louis Browns than I knew about the Cleveland Indians. It was a process of discovery for me. And whenever I was doing research on this and sort of coming across the different ways that these characters intersected even before they got onto the Indians, and then how they played off of each other once they made it onto the Indians, I was really excited and thought that this was one of the most interesting narratives that I could have possibly come across. And so I decided to write the book through that point of view, like staying very close to the time, not sort of venturing into statistics or historical analysis or anything like that. I really wanted to tell the book as if it were a novel, told from these main characters' point of views, and capture the excitement of that time, the sort of thrillingness, the unpredictability, and the coincidental nature of these four men coming together. And so that was the sort of idea of how to put together the book. So yeah, I really dug into Cleveland's fandom, and it was an excellent thing for me. I moved to Cleveland. I lived there for a while. Yeah, I really dug into it. That was maybe one of the harder parts because I'm a huge Cardinal fan, and there's such a different philosophical outlook when it comes to fandom in these two places. The Cardinal fan is very blessed by fortune. We win World Series we should not win. We win playoff games we should not win. We make it into the playoffs when we shouldn't make it into the playoffs. We are a very fortunate franchise. We feel that, you know, a World Series every 10 years is kind of our right. It's a blessed by fortune franchise. And Cleveland obviously is quite different. It's a much more sort of waiting for the sky to cave in franchise. It seems like something always goes wrong. You all are just on the cusp of winning the World Series, and then something happens. It's a kind of a more snake bitten franchise, and so that was an interesting sort of outlook to get into. And it was even that way back when I was researching the 1948 team. So yeah, I guess that's a little bit of how I came about the book, why I wrote it, and how I wrote it. So yeah, do you all have any questions? I'd love to answer them.
Yeah. Go ahead. Anybody have opener?
I'll start with a note.
Yep.
Luke, my name is Mike Curtin. I love the book. It was a wonderful read, and I'll recommend it to many others. So thank you for that. I thought the structure that you described and put it together was a brilliant way to do it. How you interweave the four principles and tell the story. I thought was magnificent. I just have one suggestion for you for the paperback edition, or maybe in an epilogue or one sentence or one paragraph edition. And correct me if I missed it, and it's stated somewhere. And not to get into the statistics as you said, but you sent me to the record book several times, and just for further reading, which good books always do. And a discovery that I made that I was totally unaware of before was that 6 players on that 48 team had their career best seasons.
Right.
Of course, Lemon, Bearden, Boudreaux, Keltner, Dale Mitchell, and Jim Hegan all had their career best seasons. I don't think that was stated in the book anywhere. And so I started looking at, well, just how good was that Dale Mitchell season? And he was statistically the 4th best outfielder in the Major League Baseball that year, behind only Musial, Williams, and DiMaggio. And Hegan was the best catcher statistically, behind only Yogi. And so I thought, well, obviously the success of that team had a lot to do with those 6 guys having their career best seasons. And just some nod to that, I thought would be worthwhile.
Well, here's my counter to that. So my book is not about the 1948 Indians. I know that it culminates in the 1948 Indians, but I'm very clear in the subtitle and in the jacket copy that it is a book about 4 men, Doby, Paige, Feller, and Beck. And I think that there have already been books about the 1948 Indians, and I'm sure that those books obviously got much more deeper into Boudreaux and to Gordon, and as you said, Dale Mitchell and things like that. And so I had to make very strategic choices about which players I really focused on and which I didn't. As you notice, like Ken Keltner doesn't really make much of an appearance at all in the book. And so if you want to obviously read a book about the 1948 Indians, I think that there are some really good ones out there. Russell Snyder wrote one. There was one that came out a couple years ago by Lou Friedman. So yeah, those would be more of a book that would sort of go into each individual on the team and how they had their career years and things like that. My book is much more invested in simply sort of weaving back and forth between the principal 4 characters and then having to go into some of the other characters as they play into the lives of those other 4 characters. So obviously you can't tell the story without Boudreaux, because one of the main preoccupations with Vec is what to do with Boudreaux. Boudreaux obviously is very important to Larry Doby's upbringing, and then Satchel Paige's integration, all that. Dale Mitchell, I mean, he kind of intersects with Doby a bit. There are some interesting stories, however, I sort of came across with Mitchell and Doby having to learn the outfield together and how Mitchell helped him. But ultimately, I had a word limit. I could not go over 300 pages. Obviously I could with the bibliography, but with the main text. And so as an author, you have to be very strategic about what you can and can't put in. So I made that strategic decision to not really deal with statistics too much. I figure that if you want to know what Larry Doby batted in a certain season, or
No,
what
I understand.
through.
I was only lobbying for one sentence or one paragraph.
Yeah.
A lot of people will read only this book because it's the best book on that 48 season. And so that was my only point. Not that you should delve deep into it, but just, I mean, I never knew that until I read your book. And it drove me to the stat pages. Yeah,
and I was kind of hoping that would be the case because, I mean, you all know that 48 season probably pretty well based on your own fandom and where you're from and things like that. But I do think for someone like me who grew up in St. Louis and did not know anything about the 48's team, it's a great gateway into it. And so then if you want to learn more about it, there's obviously a lot of it online and you can look it up. But the sort of, the sort of decisions an author has to make about how to tell a certain story come into play there. And I mean, there's a lot of other things you could talk about with, the sort of RBIs that entire infield came together, the defensive metrics of that infield from the 1948 team, all of that sort of stuff could really get at why that 48 team was fantastic. But my editor kept saying to me, this is not a book about the 1948 Indians. This is a book about 4 men, and you've got to keep the focus on those 4 men. So that was sort of our decision making.
Thank you.
As an aside, and that's the guy wearing the pirate sweatshirt, I think the 79 Pirates were another one of those teams where they had like 6 guys had career years that never had quite as good as years they did in 79. Foley, Omar Marino, Ed Ott. I mean, a lot of guys had really good seasons. And so, all right.
Luke?
Mark?
I have a question about the Bob Feller telescope incident. How well was that known in the baseball community? Didn't that kind of put him right up there with the Astros on using technology to cheat?
It's hard to get sort of contemporaneous response to it. I think the closest you're going to get is that during a game in September against the Yankees, I think that it was Allie Reynolds was pitching or something like that. And the count was 3-0 to Joe Gordon. And I did talk to Eddie Robinson, and Eddie Robinson confirmed that Joe Gordon was one of the Indians who did get the signs during that sort of stretch run of the pennant. Allie Reynolds was not expecting Joe Gordon to swing at 3-0, and he got the sign, swung, and hit a home run. And immediately, Allie Reynolds apparently turned around, scanned the outfield, scanned everywhere he could look, because he just had this sense that the Indians were stealing signs. And so if it wasn't exactly known how it was being done with that telescope, I think that people were catching on. And so Eddie Robinson said they had to sort of cool it down sometimes if they got a sense that pitchers were getting warm to them. And if you read Vec is in Rec, Bill Vec, he talks a lot about sort of the way that the grounds crew used to manicure the field in a way that would help Indians batters and hurt opposing batters. He talked about all these advantages and disadvantages that he could find for home and opposing teams. And then he very, very sort of cryptically talks about deeper cheating scandals that were going on at the time. And if you know that the Indians were stealing signs, you'll be able to sort of guess that that is what Bill Vec is talking about. So obviously it went up to the front office. Vec knew they used the groundskeepers to sort of relay the signs. the top pitchers, Bob Lemon and Bob Feller, were in the scoreboard stealing the signs. I think that it wasn't exactly a secret, but I think that Feller was just saying that so many other teams did it at the time that it wasn't. I don't know. I don't know if people were necessarily outraged by it. I think that Feller's attitude was that the other team should have figured it out and tried to thwart it. So yeah.
He even stole government property to do it, huh?
I mean, from what I understand, he was allowed to take that home. So, but yeah, he did use. I always thought that was the most interesting part about that story, though, because the sort of way that I try to shade Feller in the opening half of the book is through this sort of persona that he adopts whenever he comes up as this sort of all-American boy, somebody who, sort of professes to the tried and true values of the American dream, somebody who won't curse, won't advertise cigarettes, won't even, drinks milk instead of beer, all this sort of stuff. And then, he turns into this war hero that sort of is the first to really enlist after Pearl Harbor, and, is very much sort of leading by example with all of these things. And then he takes the very instrument that sort of allows him to be a hero and turns it to what is a very sort of deceptive means. And I always thought that that was a great symbol of the way that Bob Feller changed when he came back from the war. Like that sort of, schoolboy hero / national hero thing gets shunted to the side as he becomes more of the sort of cutthroat businessman / do whatever it takes to win the pennant guy. I always thought that was a really interesting inversion of the Feller persona.
I had never read a book on just Feller. I think I have now pitching on my shelf, but have not got to it. So I was really surprised at how intensely he went after arranging all the barnstorming he did, and the motivation where he just was trying to, quote, make up for lost time and get the money that he was, quote, due.
It froze up.
It
Blake
gave me a
was
little.
talking and he froze up. Everybody froze but me on here.
Really?
I'm not sure what.
Yeah, it looks like people on Zoom might be frozen.
Are you guys
No,
all frozen?
Now we're
No,
Fine.
I can hear.
Okay. So anyways, I was really surprised by that. And it actually gave me some balance for the character in your book, in the fact that I also did not realize that he was he was such a hero coming out of high school, and that he was such a beloved character early in his career, that he was like the next really big thing in baseball. So I felt like it was fairly well balanced.
I would just say that like that persona that Feller adopted when he breaks into the majors, sets the strikeout records, and really, kind of sets America on fire, so much so that, he's on the cover of Time magazine, his high school graduation is being broadcast live from coast to coast. Like he becomes the biggest figure in sports there for a while. And I think that one of the reasons why it happens, in addition to his incredible things that he's doing on the field, are that he represents these sort of tried and true values of America. And they're thought to be sort of these turn back values, where in the 1920s, you've got, urbanization. For the first time, more people live in cities than on the farm. And so everybody's sort of looking towards machines and automation and all of these other sorts of things. And then it sort of comes crashing down in the Depression, and people really start to turn back to simpler times. They start sort of looking to rural America, farms, things like this. And Feller is such a great avatar of that sensibility. But it's a little bit of a false avatar, because his dad was a tremendously successful businessman, even though he was a farmer who had no running water and electricity. Feller's sister was still alive when I was writing the book. And she was telling me that the dad during the Depression bought up tons of property in Iowa. He bought up garages, he bought up rental properties, he bought up other farms. Like, he was a very savvy businessman. And Bob Feller certainly learned from his dad how to do that. And, you know, his dad may have sort of cleared a portion of his pasture to build Bob Feller a baseball diamond, but it wasn't necessarily an altruistic act. I mean, they charged money for people to attend those games. They sold them things from a concession stand at that place. Like, even if his dad, maybe they didn't turn a tremendous profit on that, they at least didn't lose money doing that. Like, you know, his father was somebody who recognized the sort of power of this. And if you read sort of the sporting news in the 1930s, one of the very first things that Bob Feller does when he comes home is get an agent and kind of advertises, I'm around to, you know, shill for your breakfast cereal if you want me to. You know, Feller has always been entrepreneurial minded. And I think that people, particularly back at that time, didn't always pick up on that because they were so busy painting him as this simple farm boy. Like, the way that I sort of put those lines in there, they think, oh, he could just go back home and be behind the plow. But that's kind of false. Like, Bob Feller recognized the power of that image and really performed to that image quite well. And in that way, he's very much like Satchel Paige. Like, Satchel Paige obviously knew the power of his persona, his image. He could adapt it to different audiences. He performed differently in front of Black audiences than he did in front of white audiences. These were two extremely entrepreneurial-minded individuals who came to the top of their profession by ability, but also came to the top of their profession by sort of business savvy. I mean, I think that the fact that these two would form a sort of a partnership together is not a coincidence. I think that they recognized in one another this great ability to generate fans and generate money. And so that, you know, the fact that Feller then comes home from war and really starts dedicating himself to it might have seen kind of a shock to people who believed in this sort of Bob Feller's a simple country boy, but the seeds were there all along for him to do that.
I have a question about the differences between Doby and Paige. And I thought that was very interesting that, you know, how you wrote about the Indians putting them together, figuring they're two African Americans, they'll get along fine, and it couldn't have been farther from the truth. Would you talk about that, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, they were from very different generations. Satchel Paige, as you know, came from the Deep South during a time of extreme Jim Crow, lynching, everything that you can imagine on that. And he sort of developed a persona that was very sort of in keeping with the times, this sort of step and fetch it sort of thing. Whenever he was becoming extremely popular in the 30s, that's right whenever Step and Fetch It was rising. And the Step and Fetch It persona, for whites at least, would be sort of a, you know, craven, sort of mumbly, not very well educated Black character who, you know, was humorous. But for black audiences, he became popular because he often sort of, you know, was also a bit of a trickster. He could sort of play to white audiences and make them think he was that way, and then he could turn the tables and get what he wanted to get out of a situation. And I think that Satchel Paige definitely fit that mold quite well. He would sort of do the slow walk to the mound. He had a deadpan demeanor. He was very, he could be humorous in interviews and things like that. And so you could get white audiences that weren't sort of used to seeing Black ball players, especially pitch against white batters, and they could sort of see Paige's persona and almost laugh at it. I mean, you could read articles at the time that called Paige a clown pitcher. He could play to a stereotype that almost gave whites comfort, but then Paige would turn the tables and start just mowing down batters. I mean, he certainly, you know, was very savvy about how he used that persona. But then by the time that Doby comes of age, that persona is considered to be undignified, out of date, almost an impediment to integration, and Doby is embarrassed by it. And he doesn't see the use of using humor to deflect situations. Doby uses the word dignified all the time. He did throughout the rest of his life. And he looked at Paige's persona and didn't see the dignity in it. And obviously Paige, who was 17 years older than Doby, did not like the fact that Doby was constantly critiquing him and criticizing him, things like that. I mean, it's interesting. You could read things, 5-10 years before Doby dies, and he's still saying that Satchel Paige was kind of bad for integration, things like that. So these were men that had extremely different philosophical views on how to be. And I guess the only other thing I would add was that, Bill Veeck gave Larry Doby the same talk that Branch Rickey gave to Jackie Robinson, the, turn the other cheek, don't sort of start any sort of brouhaha, like always be mindful of how you're sort of conducting yourself, that sort of thing. There's no evidence that he ever gave that to Satchel Paige. And, this Bill Veeck sort of intuition that Satchel Paige was who he was. And you could read black newspapers at the time, and they were very critical of Paige at various times, whenever Paige would show up late, when he would miss buses, when he would miss trains. If he, they thought that Paige was giving black ball players a bad name, and they were constantly trying to, write articles to correct his behavior. So it wasn't just Doby who was doing this, but Paige was who he was. And so I think he was the first black ball player in Major League Baseball who came in fully as himself and did not, feel any need to sort of temper his personality based on the fact that he finally crossed over.
Thank you.
Luke?
Yeah.
I suspect if you had had a fifth person featured in the book, it might have been Lou Boudreau.
Yes.
And I think your decision not to do that was a good one. But I'm just curious, when you talk about Boudreau in the book, it's primarily in terms of whether he's going to be fired or rehired.
Yeah.
What other thoughts do you have about Boudreau and how he fits into the larger picture that you weren't able to put in the book?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if this was a book about the 48 Indians, Boudreau would probably be front and center. And like he would be, I mean, you can't sort of, I mean, he was the MVP that year. He was the manager, all of the sort of 9 yards that you got. I mean, I think that there's so much you could go into with him. I mean, I think the 47 season with Boudreau is really fascinating because Veeck has already declared his intention of wanting to get a new manager. And so Boudreau spends the entire 47 season frantically trying to prove to Veeck that he is capable, to the point where he spends almost half the year taking the pitch calling duties away from Jim Hegan. He's the one who is sort of flashing the signals from shortstop for Hegan to relay to the mound. He thinks that that's going to impress Veeck, or at least make Boudreau seem indispensable. It has the opposite effect. Veeck is sort of aware of the fact that the other Indians are not happy with the fact that Boudreau is doing this. And then, you've got this sort of, I think if you put integration on top of that, Larry Doby did not have very good things to say about Boudreau for the rest of his life. I talked to one of Doby's confidants later in life, and he kind of told me, semi-privately, that that Doby would badmouth Boudreau behind closed doors, including later in life, just kind of feeling like Boudreau did the minimal work to make him feel part of the team. He did not think that Boudreau was particularly welcoming toward him, or talk to players that didn't particularly want him on the team. And it's, I mean, I think that with Boudreau, you could sort of see from his point of view that he's doing whatever he can to save his own hide. And integration is such a complex and difficult thing that he himself did not call for. He himself was sort of unprepared for. Veeck did not do a good job of sort of communicating with Boudreau that this was going to be something that the Indians were going to be pursuing. Boudreau found out very shortly before it was going to happen. So you can understand Boudreau's predicament there. So yeah, I mean, he's really kind of doing, you know, two full-time jobs at once and stretching himself very thin at the same time. And there's all these other incredible games. Like, I mean, there was some of the harder cuts I had to make in the book was like in August of 1948, you know, Boudreaux has a very bad injury that he has to sit for. And there's a game against the Yankees where it's a really tight game. There are runners, I think, on the corners or something, and Boudreaux inserts himself in as a pinch hitter, and the entire stadium is going crazy. And I think Bill Veeck stands up and he's quoted in the newspaper as saying, "I don't know what's going to happen here, but this is the greatest moment of the season." And Boudreaux, of course, gets a clutch hit and he sort of limps his way to first, and the crowd goes wild. And that's kind of like, you know, showing the sort of gumption that Boudreaux has to sort of play through pain, play through his own sort of shortcomings, because he had a lot of them. So there's a lot there to explore, and that was obviously a very tough thing to have to cut out. But you know, as I said, it's not really a book that follows the 1948 season very closely. It tries to follow these four characters. So I think that, like, what I tried to do, as I said, was to sort of think about the way that these four men represented a different facet of the integration experience and sort of stood for something larger than themselves. And Boudreaux just didn't have that sort of, he didn't slot as easily into there. And I didn't think that, I couldn't quite figure out sort of how to use him as standing for something larger than himself. And then, of course, you know, whenever you're publishing a book, with a publisher who puts very specific limits on you and your agent, you have to think about sort of like space constraints and how much you can do that. Because if there was going to be a fifth player, you're right, it would have been Boudreaux. If there was going to be a sixth player, which it could have been, because I probably would have wanted to have another one, it would have been Effa Manley. I was fascinated by Effa Manley. I did not know anything about her. I think I wrote 50 extra pages on Effa Manley that my editor ended up cutting, because he was just like, she's not a principal. But I was like, but I think she's one of the most interesting people in baseball history. I was just blown away by her and what she managed to do and her own personality. So if there would have been two more people, it would have been Boudreaux and Effa Manley.
Thank you.
Luke, your research for this book speaks for itself. The bibliography speaks for itself. Obviously very impressive. In all of that voluminous research, if you had to pick one newspaper person, one journalist, you know, one magazine from that era, whose works stands the test of time, whose work we ought to maybe dig deeper into to appreciate from that, for the whole era that you covered, given all that research, who would you recommend? Whose stuff was really great?
I know that somebody's name that is all over this book is Gordon Cobbledick. I love that name. It's such a great name. But I don't think I would pick him. I think his writing was a little dry. I don't think he has the character of some of these other writers. I think the best Cleveland writer at that time, at least according to the ones I saw, was Franklin Lewis. His writing was very colorful. He had very strong opinions, some of which were quite wrong, but he was not shy in expressing them. He is extremely valuable to me because out of all the Cleveland writers, he was the only one who recognized, wait a minute, this kid from Newark is about to get signed by the Indians. And he packed up everything he had and went to Newark and saw Larry Doby's last game on the Newark Eagles. And so he's there in the stadium writing dispatches from Ruppert Stadium in Newark, New Jersey. He goes into the locker room afterward and hangs out with Doby. Then he follows Doby to the train station at Newark Penn Station. And so all those great scenes that you get of Larry Doby, kind of almost like, he's not quite comatose, but he's just so nervous and just he can hardly talk. Come from Franklin Lewis. Like, he's in the train station with Larry Doby, observing him as he's about to sort of go on an overnight journey that will change his life forever. That's great journalistic instincts for him to have done that. And then he kind of writes about it on and off for a while. You have to sort of dig deep to find them. But he, like on the anniversary of that game, he'll occasionally sort of write another column about what it was like to be there and give you more insight into it. So that was extremely valuable. And he is just really fun to read. I also think that Sport Magazine, which started in 1940, was it 6, has some of the greatest sports writing of all time. They give their writers a ton of leeway. I mean, we're talking about 10,000 word stories. And during the 1948 season, there are tremendously great articles about the Indians. Gordon Cobbledick did a very long one on Bill Veeck, which was great. He then did one on Satchel Paige, which was equally good. Ed Lynn, who is a fantastic writer, as you might know, co-wrote Veeck is in Wreck with Bill Veeck, was a writer for Sport Magazine, and he did one on Boudreaux, which was just fantastic. There are several articles on Bob Feller that trace sort of the hero origin of Bob Feller, and then in 1948 really talk about how Bob Feller was struggling. So I don't know if you can find those easily, but it's really worthwhile to sort of look at the 1948, 1949 editions of Sport Magazine, because the Indians are all over that. And you can just read some fantastically great articles about those teams. So those would be my 2 recommendations: Franklin Lewis of the Cleveland Press and Sport Magazine from 1948, 1949.
Thank you.
But by the way, Luke, that question comes from he just retired from the Columbus Dispatch, is the chief editor
Oh,
of
cool.
the Dispatch. I actually first met him in probably 1979 when I was doing an internship at Franklin County, and he was a beat
Nice.
reporter. So he
Awesome.
went the route. Did I get the final
Congrats.
title? Was it?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. So anyways, that's the perspective we value, is
Yeah, man.
his participation in here.
Congrats. Awesome.
Jim, looks like you're getting ready to ask a question.
I could, yeah. There's excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm not a Cleveland fan. I'm not a Cleveland fan, but I remember a lot of this. So not 1948. That's a little before my time, but anyway. What I was surprised about. Am I on? Yeah. The Cleveland fans that I know always held Bob Feller in the highest regard.
Yeah.
He's just like on another level from all the other players. And I was surprised to read, this was all news to me, about he fell out of favor and was booed by the home fans and all that sort of thing. So that I just had no idea of that. And then he kind of redeemed himself and it seemed to get back in favor. But I didn't know there was this period where, after being this, favorite, that he fell off the table and getting booed and all that thing. So that was news.
Yeah, it's interesting because he comes back, a complete hero. He has an incredible 1946 season. I mean, just almost pitches his arm off to get there, and really kind of tires out. And then he does that blowout barnstorming tour, and he spends a lot of the 1947 season kind of battling major league front offices or executives to try to maintain the similar barnstorming thing that he had last year. And Major League Baseball starts putting restrictions on him, and Feller is very vocal about opposing them. And that is right at the time that he's also incorporated himself, done the radio show, the newspaper column, all that. And so Indians fans think that his, I think this is an attitude that happens nowadays, where if somebody their performance starts to lag a little bit, somebody will look at a commercial on TV and be like, oh, he's too focused on his own sort of personal endeavors rather than one on the field. So I think Indians fans start to feel that, and you get these articles into the paper that Bob Feller is only out for himself, that he cares more about making money than getting the Indians to a World Series championship. And Feller himself does himself no favors, because he kind of has no filter and just says what's on his mind. And often what's on his mind is just, I want to be able to make money. And in 1948, then, of course, he starts out extremely poorly. He has he's under 500 at the All-Star break, and it really is kind of like the Indians are all having these incredible years, as the first comment showed, that it's just a magical season for everybody but Bob Feller. And so, I mean, I always thought it was interesting that, like, if Bob Feller had just a sort of, it didn't even have to be a typical Feller year, but just kind of an average Feller year where he's still pretty great.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the Indians would have signed Satchel Paige. Maybe Bill Veeck would have been like, we don't need pitching help. So it really is kind of Feller's swoon that leads to Paige's rise. The other thing I'll say about Feller is that I was very conscious about starting the book with Bob Feller. The book opens with Feller coming home as kind of a hero. And the first chapter of the book is very much about the sort of rise of Bob Feller's story. I think that origin story is still unsurpassed. I think it's the greatest athlete origin story this country has ever known. It's an incredible piece of, I mean, it reads like a storybook, and that's kind of how I characterize it throughout the book. And then the book ends with Bob Feller in the Indians locker room after Game 6, alone, just kind of not celebrating, feeling like because he lost 2 games in the World Series, he didn't contribute to this, that it's not his World Series to celebrate. And everybody else around him just going crazy. And Larry Doby is the one who really focuses in on him and sort of notices the exclusion, the solitude, and goes over to him and shakes his hand. And I wanted that moment to be kind of like, a sort of passing of the torch for origin stories, because I think that Larry Doby's origin story, this person who traveled overnight from the Negro Leagues to the major leagues, really struggled in 1947 and then had this kind of miraculous turnaround in 1948. I think it's equally as improbable, interesting, incredible as that. And so the book sort of ends, it doesn't end on that, but like one of the sort of last things you have is that. So you've got sort of the Feller Doby inversion going in the book. And that was what I was like, when I was first starting the book, I was like, I'm building toward that handshake between Doby and Feller. That's always was conscious in my mind. So I'm going to start with Feller, then I'm going to build toward that handshake. So yeah, Feller, I mean, my editor kept being like, do we really need all that Feller? And I was like, we have to have all that Feller. Like Feller has to, like all that Feller has to stay in.
Right. I would say, just in passing, if any of you are in Mobile, Alabama, the battleship Alabama is docked there permanently, and they have a wonderful Bob Feller display. That's the ship that he served on all during World War II and missed 4 seasons right out of the prime of his career. And when you go in, there's a little lobby thing, and they have a display case there. And then as you tour the ship, they have his bunk where he bunked just everybody else, common place. But they have a little plaque on his where he lived on the ship or so.
Yeah, I went to see that. It's great. Yeah.
I have a question with Bob. When Bob Feller was trying to barnstorm, I remember if I remember correctly, you said that Bill Veeck thought he was looking through rose-colored glasses with how much he would get from it.
Yeah, he did.
This entrepreneur himself, did he ever try to talk Bob Feller out of it and say, we can get you more endorsement, we can get you Kellogg's Corn Flakes, we can get you Heinz 57? Did he ever try to dissuade him so he wouldn't be running around as much?
No, in Veeck is in Rec, Bill Veeck talks about how when he first bought the team in 1946, the Indians, he thought that the best publicity asset they had was Bob Feller. And Bob Feller was very vocal, as he always was, about making it known that he was going for the single season strikeout record. And so Bill Veeck recognized that as a tremendous publicity asset in 1946 and really he talked to Boudreaux, he talked to some other people being like, pitch Bob Feller as often as possible, because the more we get him on the mound, the more fans that we can get into the stadium. So he certainly recognized Feller as a publicity asset. And, I think that I included a long scene in the book with Bob Feller and Bill Veeck signing a contract, because Bill Veeck certainly let the press know that Bob Feller was coming to sign a contract. And like, I mean, Beck understood, you know, the sort of way that like Feller and money in particular could attract the press. And so Beck was not hesitant in using Feller that way. The comment that you're talking about was, it was in a column by a guy named Alvin Bud Silverman, and it wasn't even in the sports pages. It was in the society pages of the Cleveland Plain Dealer right during the World Series as it was starting. And apparently Bill Veeck was going all around town, you know, saying Bob Feller is doing this blowout tour, all this, you know, I wish him well. I hope he does well. But apparently he was whispering in private to people that he expected Feller to lose his shirt. That, you know, because these things are crapshoots. You get some bad weather, you get some indifferent fans and all this sort of stuff. You never know what's going to happen. So Veeck himself did not necessarily believe in what Feller was doing, even if Feller himself had this great confidence. And a lot of sports writers at the time took that point of view because I think it was kind of something we talked about earlier. They looked at him still as this Iowa farm boy. Who does this Iowa farm boy think he is, doing this, you know, blowout tour with airplanes and stuff like that? They didn't recognize that this Iowa farm boy had been raised by a very great entrepreneur and had business in his bones from an early age. And so Feller, it's sort of a matter of people underestimating Feller time and time again in terms of a business sense.
Did they think that pitching that much would injure his arm? Were they concerned about that at that time, or?
Yeah, there was. There was an article that I cut in the book that I wish I would have kept in. In 1946, they interviewed Boudreau for the Sporting News in September, and Boudreau, because Feller, in addition to pitching, you know, a tremendously heavy innings load in 1946, and then going on to do the barnstorming tour, was somebody you simply couldn't keep off the field. Even in his off days, he was out there sort of running sprints and doing, you know, exercises and throwing on the side. And Boudreau was talking about how, you know, they were locking up the stadium so that Feller wouldn't come in and work out. They were like, you need to rest, Bob. And so even Boudreau was worried about Feller's innings load and management, stuff like that. There's no sort of indication that Bill Veeck really was. Veeck kind of allowed Feller to do what he wanted to, but certainly Boudreau was. And of course, Indians fans and sports writers were talking the entire time about how this is a terrible idea for Bob Feller. He needs to rest. He's tired himself out. And that becomes a narrative in 1947 and 1948 that, you know, Feller always claimed that he didn't have a great season in 47 and 48 because he had that injury in June where he kind of fell off the mound, really probably should have gone on the injured reserve list and healed from some of the injuries he suffered, but stubbornly refused to do so. And so his injuries never quite healed, to the point where Feller claimed he never had his great fastball after that injury. So, you know, but I think Bob Feller was being a little, he himself was discounting the fact that he'd simply thrown too many innings and he did need to rest. And the barnstorming probably did do him in a little bit.
Luke, when you were researching this book, was there something that really surprised you about any of the 4 men in question?
Well, as I said, I didn't know a lot about these individuals. And so, you know, I mean, I knew the most about Veeck because of my grandpa. I knew about Paige because of this idea. He's kind of a folkloric figure still in American culture. I knew about Bob Feller just because of who he was. All the things that surprised me were about Doby. I mean, I knew him mainly as an answer to a trivia question, who is the second Black player in the 20th century in Major League Baseball. I did not know, you know, this idea that he played a game for the Newark Eagles, boarded an overnight train, and the very next day was on the Indians. All of that was just fascinating to me. And I felt like Doby is the hardest person to get to know. You know, Bill Veeck, Bob Feller, and Satchel Paige made a living telling their stories. were crafting their narratives almost from the moment that they broke into professional baseball. They all recognized that their narratives were a currency and that they could use that currency to cash in throughout their lives. And so each one of those men wrote more than one autobiography. You know, Feller wrote like 5. Yeah, they sort of are continuously telling their story. And so one of the challenges with them is to find ways in which their stories begin to diverge, or to, to find the embellishments. When do they start adding things to their stories that might not have happened? That's always the sort of challenge with those. The challenge with Doby is simply to find him talking anywhere. He never wrote his autobiography, which is a tremendous shame. He was very taciturn in interviews. I think I said that he treated interviews like settling into a dentist chair. His oral histories are very curt. But sometimes he could be just disarmingly honest if you caught him at the right point. Like there's a great sort of thing in the book where in spring training, Franklin Lewis kind of catches up to him in the outfield before one game, and Doby just kind of bears his soul to him. And it's just like, I'm lonely. I've been in segregated accommodations. I don't know why people are treating me like this. It's just this tremendous moment of candor that you need to really dig through archival material to find those moments of candor. And then obviously you have to sort of rely on people like Franklin Lewis, who were just like, let's go to this last game and see how it is, with him on the Newark Eagles. And then you have to sort of reconstruct it from there. So felt like everything I was learning about Doby was a revelation, to the point where I was just like, his story is one of the greatest baseball stories you could ever come across, as good as Bob Feller. And we all know Bob Feller's story, but like the Larry Doby story is as exciting, as improbable, as American as Bob Feller's story, and it deserves to be in the same breath. And so I wanted to sort of, that was the sort of idea of the book ending of those stories, because I think that it's equally as valid, but it's just much harder to piece together because he didn't use it as a sort of currency the way that Bob Feller did.
Luke, this is Joe Shaw from the Cleveland chapter. You may remember that you spoke to us at our book club earlier in the year, and we thoroughly enjoyed the book so much that I wanted to come back and hear you again today. I wanted to ask you just a totally out of left field question, but somewhat based upon what you said in this last answer. What do you think might have happened if there would have been a role reversal? If Larry Doby would have been signed as the first player by the Dodgers and Jackie Robinson, the second player by the Indians? What do you think might have happened? What kind of trajectory change might there have been? I realize it's an out of left field question, but you obviously have studied Larry Doby deeply.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when Larry Doby comes up to Cleveland in 1947, the change is so abrupt, not only to him, but to his new Indians teammates, that the transition period is very not only strong, but visceral. So, you get that sort of scene that I'm sure everybody has heard about before they even read my book, where Doby comes into the Indians locker room and some people don't shake his hand and some people turn their back to him. And, the Indians players themselves have not quite digested the fact that this is happening. And neither has Doby. Like he told Wendell Smith later on that he was so nervous when he came to bat for the first 10 times that he can't stop his teeth from chattering. So he has this period where he's clearly playing below his capabilities and struggling mightily in the transition. And then you have things like Eddie Robinson basically quitting the team rather than giving a playing time to Larry Doby, which causes Boudreau to be very hesitant to put Doby into the starting lineup, which he doesn't do for the rest of the season. So you've got this sort of perfect storm in 1947 of, something that makes Larry Doby seem much less of a player than he really was. If he'd been signed by the Dodgers, Branch Rickey would have 100% sent him to the minor leagues. Doby could have gotten out these jitters there. There would have been sort of a greater awareness of who he was among white players, just sort of knowing that he was in the farm system. And if he was performing well in the farm system, which I imagine he would have, this idea that he's probably going to be coming up to the majors. So players would have at least been familiar with his name. And you know, Jackie Robinson struggled the first month or so into the 1947 season, but then really turned it around and ended up having a tremendous year. And so I would not have been surprised if Larry Doby would have had a similar trajectory there. I don't know if, I'm not sure how the Dodgers would have handled his transition from the infield to the outfield. But, you know, just knowing what we know about Larry Doby, his talent was so evident and so undeniable that I'm sure he would have found his footing quite quickly. So yeah, I think that all that stuff that he had to work through in the majors on the Indians, he could have worked through in the minors. And it would have been, I think, a much better transition for him. And even Bill Beck, you know, admitted that he kind of made a mistake with the way that he transitioned Larry Doby. I mean, it's hard to sort of take Beck at face value though, because if, I don't know, I mean, people really thought that Doby needed another year in the minors at 48. And if Doby would have started in the minors, maybe he wouldn't have made the Indians team in 1948. So, and then the Indians, I don't think would have won the World Series or even made it to the World Series. So, you know, these things happen for a reason, and the Indians should feel very lucky. But yeah, I think that Doby would have probably had an easier time on the Dodgers and would have had an equally illustrious career.
Thank you.
I always appreciate at the end of a book like this, a good epilogue. And I thought yours was a particularly good one in this book, despite the fact that it started out just with the heartbreaking story about Doby and his wife trying to buy a house, and the reality of the time still like hitting them in the face, where people wouldn't show their houses, but and a myriad of excuses why they couldn't sell him a house where he wanted. So, but as a whole, I thought that your epilogue was really terrific. So just a comment, I guess.
Thanks. The book was originally called The First Fine Careless Rapture. Bill Beck used that term a lot. In the 1970s, when the Indians were kind of the early 70s, when they were facing hard times, there was sort of ideas of them even moving to like New Orleans or Seattle or something. There were a group of people in Cleveland who were going to Maryland, where Bill Beck was living, to try to convince him to rebuy the Indians and sort of, you know, do what he did in 1948, turn the team around, save them, all this sort of stuff. And every time Bill Beck would get interviewed about this, he would always say, you can never recapture the first fine careless rapture. It's a line from a Robert Browning poem. So I really thought that was the working title of the book. So the way that I always thought about it was, for these four men, the 1948 season in particular is kind of the first fine careless rapture of their lives. And it's the only time any of them win the Major League World Series. There is sort of a cresting to their, at least their professional achievements, that then they would chase for the rest of their lives. And then that sort of carried over basically into Cleveland too. Like, I talked to a lot of people that were alive during this time, and they were saying that this was really Cleveland at its apex, with, you know, sort of population booming and manufacturing booming, and you know, athletic stardom, not only for the Indians, but for the Browns and all that. And so, yeah, it was kind of like this sort of enrapturing moment of 1948. And then the epilogue is kind of slowly letting the air out of the tire. But I should say that my publishing house hated the title, The First Fine Careless Rapture. So it It didn't make the final cut, and honestly, I can't blame them. It's a very confusing title for a baseball book, and they were very right to not like it. But that was my working title, and so I always knew that I wanted that sort of, I wanted it to sort of like be this tremendously triumphant narrative, and then just kind of let it down at the end.
Rick?
Yeah, Luke, was it touchy interviewing Eddie Robinson, considering his reaction to Doby when he arrived with the tribe?
Eddie Robinson, I talked to him on the phone, and I realized that there was only so much we could do. And so I basically invited myself to his house, and he was very gracious. I flew down there. I spent a weekend with him in Dallas. We ended up going out to dinner a few times, and he was very generous. Whenever we probably recorded 2 or 3 hours of interviews, and one of which was really on Doby. And, you know, he's very adamant that that his objection to Larry Doby was based solely on playing time. And I think that if you sort of look at his history, you can sort of understand it. I mean, he had been in the minors for a while. He'd been in the service. He'd come back, and he was something like 26 or something like that. So really, this was his shot. He started out the 46th season as the starting first baseman, and then he kind of kept getting benched for pretty significant periods of time, like weeks on end, to a guy named Les Fleming. And it got to the point where he said that he marched into Bill McKechnie's office, who is one of the assistant coaches on the Indians, also, you know, great Hall of Fame coach in his own right. And basically said, I'm tired of Boudreau jerking me around like this. And McKechnie said, well, why don't you just go talk to him? You know, and so he did. He went and talked to Boudreau, and Boudreau was very supportive and was just like, you don't need to worry about anything. You are our starting first baseman. Like, I'm just trying to figure out combinations, but you are going to be the starting first baseman now and years in the future. And so Eddie Robinson was very heartened by this talk, and he started actually playing a lot better. And then Larry Doby very unexpectedly makes the team. And it's sort of immediately, if you read particularly the black newspapers, sort of figures that he's going to be playing first. And so now Eddie Robinson is sharing time with Doby. Larry Doby was very adamant later in his life that he would never name the people that refused to shake his hand. He said that they didn't deserve to be named, that he didn't want to dignify that, but that's not quite true. In 1964, the Boston Globe interviewed Doby, and he said that Eddie Robinson and Les Fleming refused to shake his hand. So I say the only real tense period when I was talking to Robinson came whenever I said, did you shake Larry Doby's hand? And Eddie Robinson, of course, was 98 years old by then or whatever, but his mind was really good, and he seemed to remember everything. And he just kind of looked at me and said, I really don't remember. And I said, really? Because Larry Doby claims you didn't. And he's like, oh, did he? And I said, yeah. And he's like, gosh, I don't know. Maybe I didn't. And, you know, it was just kind of a little bit tense. And if you kind of pushed him a little bit on the racial angle, there was one point where he lost his patience with me and said, well, nobody was happy with this. We all didn't think that we should be the one experimenting with integration. So, you know, Eddie Robinson had his narrative and he told his narrative, but I think beneath it, there was, you know, he grew up in Texas. I'm sure that the playing time was very significant to him, and I'm sure it was the overriding factor, but I also believe that other factors played into mind, and he was a little bit more reluctant to talk about those.
I give you credit for talking to him and asking those questions. That would be kind of a difficult part of the interview. But
yeah, but he was very honest. He was very honest, and he was honestly, I mean, he did erupt a few times, but we had a great rapport, and you know, he'd probably gotten those questions quite a bit in his life. And I should mention that I'm sure you all probably know this, but much later in his life, he wrote his own autobiography. It's called Lucky Me. And he talks about it quite a bit in that autobiography as well. And it's very well worth checking out.
Any others? If not, Luke, we really appreciate you taking over an hour with us today.
Yeah, no problem.
Obviously, we all love the book, and
Cool.
and we really appreciate your directness in answering our questions.
Hope it wasn't too direct, but
No.
yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm glad you all liked it, and yeah, I'll take any comments, criticism, whatever. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, Luke.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Luke,
Luke.
we had one more question, just looking in the future. What are you working on now?
Oh, so because I got so excited writing this book, and because I was just blown away by the stories that went into this, I don't know if I'm ever going to come across a better baseball story. I think that this baseball story just had everything. I mean, Beck and Paige and Doby and all this sort of stuff. I was just like, wow, this book is so fun. I'm not going to try, and so I'm writing a basketball book right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's going to be sort of the transition from the ABA to the NBA. I think the ABA, there's a great, obviously, I'm sure you all know the book. There's that great oral history book, Loose Balls by Terry Pluto. But I want to sort of focus, I'm focusing in very similar to this book on like 2 or 3 figures, and sort of going to tell that transition through those individuals, and they're still alive. So I've already started the interviewing process. So yeah.
Well, thank you. What and anything else? Well, again, we appreciate the time. We appreciate the discussion. We're going to go ahead and take care of some administrative details just about our next book. But
Yeah, awesome.
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.
Excellent.
I think I'll stop the recording here.